A father sits at his kitchen table at midnight, ex-wife custody schedule, 48 hours until his daughter's 10th birthday, and he has absolutely no idea what to say to her anymore. They haven't spoken more than 10 words in 3 weeks. So instead of picking up the phone, he picks up a pen. He writes her one page, just one. He doesn't try to fix the divorce, doesn't try to explain the fighting, doesn't try to make himself the hero of the story. He just writes down plainly that he's proud of her, that he thinks about her every single day, that being her father is the best thing he's ever done. He slips it into her backpack before school. That night she calls him, first time in 3 weeks. She read it 4 times. Nothing about their situation changed in those 48 hours. The custody schedule was exactly the same. The distance between two houses was exactly the same. And yet, somehow, one page of handwriting did something that dozens of tense phone calls hadn't managed to do in months. Here's the question that's actually worth asking. Why does a piece of paper reach places a voice can't? That's the entire subject of Henriette Ann Closser's book, Put Your Heart on Paper. And her answer will change how you think about every relationship you've been meaning to repair, but haven't quite known how to start. Stick with me. This one will have you reaching for a pen before it's over. A simple truth to start. Here's the plain truth Closser opens with, and it's simpler than anything you'd expect from a book about writing. The spoken word disappears the moment it's said. The written word stays. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. When you tell someone you love them, the sound waves are gone in under a second, filed away in an imperfect, fading memory. When you write it down and hand it to them, it becomes an object. It can be reread at 2 a.m. during a bad week. It can be kept in a wallet for 30 years. It can outlive you. Anne Frank, writing from hiding as a teenager with nothing left to lose, put it more simply than any writing instructor ever could. Paper is more patient than people. She meant it about her own confessions, but it applies with equal force in the other direction. Paper doesn't interrupt. It doesn't get defensive. It doesn't change the subject when things get uncomfortable. It just holds whatever you give it, exactly as long as it takes the other person to be ready to receive it. Why we default to talking, and why that's often the weaker choice asterisk. Closser spends real time on a question most of us never stop to ask. Why do we assume speaking is always the more intimate, more real form of connection, and writing is somehow the lesser backup option, the thing you resort to only when you can't manage a real conversation? Her answer flips that assumption on its head. Speech, she points out, happens in real time under pressure, with the other person's face right there watching for your reaction. That pressure makes most of us edit ourselves down, soften what we actually mean, rush past the important part to fill an awkward silence, or lose our nerve entirely halfway through the sentence that mattered most. Writing removes the audience. You can draft it, sit with it, cross out the sentence that sounded too harsh, and only hand over the version that actually says what you meant. That isn't dishonesty. It's precision. Closser's argument is that a written apology, a written thank you, a written I'm proud of you, often ends up more honest than its spoken equivalent, precisely because it wasn't produced under the pressure of someone's eyes on your face in real time. The lunchbox note, small enough to actually do today. One of the smallest examples in the book turns out to carry the most weight, and it's worth starting here, because it requires nothing more than a napkin and 30 seconds. A parent every morning tucks a folded note into a child's lunchbox. Some days it's just good luck on your math test. Some days it's a bad joke. Once in a while, it's something closer to I know today is hard and I'm thinking about you. The child, by their own account years later, kept every single one, not because any individual note was profound, but because the accumulated weight of hundreds of them over years became undeniable proof of attention that no single conversation could have delivered. Here's the mechanism worth noticing. None of these notes required a special occasion. That's precisely the point Chaucer is making throughout the book. We tend to reserve writing for weddings, funerals, and milestone birthdays, treating it as ceremonial, reserved for life's biggest moments. But the relationships that actually run out of connection rarely die from the absence of one big gesture. They erode from the slow absence of 1,000 small ones. A lunchbox note is the antidote to erosion, not to catastrophe. Writing what you can't say out loud. Chaucer devotes significant attention to the specific category of things that seem to get stuck in the throat when spoken but flow easily onto paper. Apologies, admissions of fault, expressions of love between people, family members especially, who never develop the habit of saying it directly. There's a well-documented letter Abraham Lincoln wrote in 1864 to Mrs. Lydia Bixby, a mother believed to have lost 5 sons in the Civil War. In it, Lincoln didn't try to explain the war, or justify it, or offer any solution to her grief at all. He simply acknowledged the size of her loss and offered what he called the thanks of the republic they died to save. Historians still debate exactly how many of her sons actually died, but the letter's power was never really about the facts. It was about a leader, with the whole machinery of a nation's spoken rhetoric at his disposal, choosing instead to put grief into a private, permanent page that a grieving mother could hold in her hands. That's the function Chaucer keeps returning to. Some emotional weight is simply too large or too tender to survive being spoken aloud in the moment. It needs the slower, more deliberate container that only writing provides. A spoken "I'm sorry" can be undercut by a shaky voice, a badly timed laugh, a flinch at the wrong moment. A written apology holds its shape exactly as intended every single time it's reread. The interactive journal, a conversation that waits for you. One of the book's more structured tools is what Chaucer calls the interactive journal, a shared notebook passed back and forth between two people, most often a parent and a teenager going through the kind of stretch where face-to-face conversation has become, for whatever reason, nearly impossible. The rules are almost embarrassingly simple. One person writes an entry, whatever they need to say, no length requirement, no obligation to be profound. They leave the notebook somewhere the other person will find it. The second person reads it, writes back whenever they're ready, no deadline attached. There's no live pressure to respond immediately, no risk of an in-person conversation spiraling into a shouting match neither of them wanted. Parents who have used this technique with withdrawn teenagers report something Chaucer highlights specifically. Kids who would flatly refuse a face-to-face conversation about anything serious will often write pages in a shared journal, precisely because the format removes the thing that made the conversation unbearable in the first place. the real-time, no-escape pressure of another person's expression, watching them respond. There's an echo here of something the poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote to a young correspondent who'd asked him for advice, that the point wasn't necessarily to answer every question at once, but to live the questions now, trusting that living with them patiently on the page might eventually lead somewhere. The interactive journal is, in a real sense, a structure for living difficult questions together, one entry at a time, without either person needing to have the whole answer ready on demand. Writing to repair, not just to celebrate. It would be easy to assume this entire approach is only useful for warmth and celebration, birthday notes and love letters. But some of the most striking material in the book concerns writing used specifically to repair damage that ordinary conversation had already failed to fix. A woman, estranged from her adult son for the better part of a decade after a bitter argument neither of them fully remembered the origin of, finally wrote him a letter. Not an argument, not a defense of her side of the old fight. Just a page acknowledging that she missed him, that she didn't need to win whatever the original disagreement had been about, and that the door was open whenever he was ready. She mailed it without any expectation of a reply. He called 2 weeks later. What made the letter work, Closser argues, wasn't cleverness or perfect phrasing. It was precisely that it made no demand. A phone call in that situation almost inevitably reopens old arguments in real time, both people defending positions from a decade ago before either has had a chance to say what they actually wanted to say. A letter, read alone in private, without an audience to perform for, gave the son room to simply receive the apology without needing to have a counterargument ready. A complete example, writing the note you've been avoiding. Let's walk through how you'd actually use this today, because Closser's method only works if it moves off the page and into your own hands. Think of one relationship right now where something has gone unsaid, an apology you've been meaning to make, a thank you never quite got around to, and I'm proud of you that's been sitting in your chest for months. Don't reach for your phone. Get an actual piece of paper. Start with one true sentence, nothing more. Not the whole explanation, not the justification, not the backstory. Just the single truest thing you'd want that person to know if this were the only sentence you got to send them. I've missed you. I was wrong, and I've known it for a while. You did something for me once that I never properly thanked you for. From that one sentence, let the rest follow naturally, without editing it into a formal speech. Closser's guidance here is specific. Write it in your actual voice, the way you'd talk if the other person's face weren't in the room, not the way you'd write for an audience. Then, and this is the part most people skip, actually deliver it, not as a text screenshot, on paper, in an envelope, in a lunchbox, on a pillow. The physical object is doing real work that a message thread simply can't replicate. The ethical will, writing what you want remembered asterisk. Toward the later part of the book, Closser introduces a practice with a somewhat formal name but a deeply personal function, the ethical will. Unlike a legal will which distributes property, an ethical will distributes values, memories, hopes, and blessings. The things that can't be itemized on a legal document but that families often wish, too late, someone had written down. The practice has ancient roots. Jewish tradition has passed ethical wills between generations for centuries, parents writing down not what they owned but what they believed, what they'd learned, what they hoped their children would carry forward after they were gone. Closer brings this tradition into an ordinary contemporary context. You don't need to be dying or even old to write one. A parent in perfect health can write a letter to be opened on a child's 18th birthday, or their wedding day, or simply whenever you need it, capturing something a spoken conversation, however heartfelt, would likely never manage to preserve intact for 20 years. There's a story, widely shared, of a woman who found, going through her late father's desk months after his death, a sealed envelope labeled simply with her name. Inside was a single page, written years earlier, describing what he'd hoped for her life, what he was proudest of, and what he wanted her to know on days when she doubted herself. He had never once said any of it to her face while he was alive. She said later that Paige did more for her grief than any conversation they'd ever actually had. Closer's point in including this isn't morbid. It's practical. The things we most want the people we love to know are frequently the things we're worst at saying spontaneously, in the moment, out loud. An ethical will removes the need for the perfect spoken moment to ever arrive at all. It exists whenever it's needed, on its own schedule, not on the unpredictable schedule of a real-time conversation that may never quite happen the way you imagined it would. Writing to the person, you can no longer talk to asterisk. One of the more emotionally direct techniques in the book involves writing to someone who is no longer available for a real conversation, either because a relationship ended badly, distance has made contact impossible, or, in the most difficult cases, because the person has died. Closer describes this not as a substitute for grief work with a professional, but as a genuinely useful complement to it. Writing a letter to a parent who died before an old argument was resolved, to an ex-spouse who will never read it, to a friend lost to a falling out years ago that neither side ever quite recovered from. The letter is never sent. That's precisely what makes it work. Without the pressure of an actual reply landing in your inbox, without needing to manage the other person's reaction, the writer is free to say the entire, unfiltered truth, including the parts that would never have survived an actual conversation. The psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl observed that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. An unfinished emotional business, an argument left hanging, a goodbye that never happened properly, is very often suffering precisely because it has no place to go, no container to hold it. A letter that will never be delivered still gives that unfinished business somewhere to land. It doesn't resolve the relationship. It resolves the silence. A practical starting ritual. If all of this sounds appealing in theory but daunting to actually begin, Closer offers a low-stakes way in that requires almost no commitment at all. Write for 3 minutes to one specific person about one specific memory and stop. Set an actual timer. Pick someone, living or not, someone you're in daily contact with or someone you haven't spoken to in 15 years. Write about a single small, concrete memory involving them, a smell, a room, an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that for some reason has stuck with you. Don't try to write a complete letter. Don't try to resolve anything. Just describe the memory in your own words for 3 minutes and then put the pen down. Closer's observation, echoed by nearly everyone who tries this exercise, is that the memory almost never stays contained to itself. It pulls other memories along with it, and very often, by the end of the 3 minutes, Something the writer didn't plan to say has already made its way onto the page. That's not an accident. It's the whole mechanism of the book working in miniature. Paper waits patiently for whatever surfaces, without needing you to know in advance what you're going to find there, preserving what would otherwise just evaporate. Asterisk. A theme that runs quietly under nearly every chapter of the book is memory. Specifically, how much of a family's actual history disappears simply because nobody ever wrote any of it down. Chaucer tells the story of a grandmother who, at a family gathering, casually mentioned crossing the country by train in 1952 to marry a man she'd met only twice. Her grandchildren, hearing the detail for the first time in their lives, asked her to write it down before she forgot the particulars, or worse. She did, eventually filling nearly 40 pages, details her own children had never once heard in 50 years of ordinary conversation. The reason this kept happening, Chaucer argues, isn't secrecy. It's simply that spoken conversation in the flow of ordinary daily life rarely creates the space for a story like that to surface. Nobody sits their grandmother down and formally asks, "Tell me everything about 1952." The story only came out because someone, almost by accident, asked her to write it, and writing, unlike a dinner table conversation, doesn't get interrupted by someone asking to pass the salt. The novelist and diarist in A Chinese Letter S. Nin wrote that we write to taste life twice, in the moment and in retrospect, and that a written record of a life is what allows anyone else to taste it at all. Without it, entire decades of a person's actual experience simply die with them, not out of any secrecy, but out of the ordinary, accidental silence that swallows most of what never gets deliberately captured. Writing as a bridge across distance. The book's subtitle, Staying Connected in a Loose Ends World, points to a use of writing that has only grown more relevant since it was first published. Maintaining closeness across real physical distance, a grown child overseas, a friend who moved across the country, a grandparent who can no longer travel. Chaucer's argument here pushes back gently against the assumption that a phone call or a video chat is automatically the warmer, more connective option compared to something as old-fashioned as a letter. A phone call happens once and then it's gone. A letter can be reread on a hard day, months after it arrived, carried in a pocket, taped to a mirror. Distance relationships that survive well, in Chaucer's observation, are very often the ones that layer both real-time conversation for immediacy and the written word for permanence, so that the connection doesn't depend entirely on both people being available and emotionally present at exactly the same moment. There's a particular kind of grief in the modern version of distance, texts sent and left on read, calls that get pushed to later and never rescheduled, precisely because so much of digital communication has adopted the disposability of speech without gaining any of writing's staying power. A text disappears into a scroll of 100 other texts by the next morning. A letter, kept in a drawer, does not. Now let's be honest. Every book like this deserves an honest accounting, and here it is. Chaucer's examples are almost without exception success stories. The estranged son who calls back, the withdrawn teenager who opens up in the journal, the marriage repaired by a letter. What the book doesn't dwell on nearly as much is what happens when the letter is sent and nothing comes back. Real relationships don't always resolve on the timeline or with the responsiveness that 50 short inspirational chapters can comfortably contain. Writing the letter is genuinely valuable even when it goes unanswered, but the book's optimistic framing can leave readers underprepared for that far more common outcome. There's a second limitation worth nomming. Clauser's method assumes a baseline of literacy, privacy, and time that not everyone has equal access to. A parent working two jobs with barely a spare half hour in a day, or someone who genuinely struggles with writing itself, isn't going to find the interactive journal as effortless as the book's warm anecdotes make it sound. The tool is real and valuable, but it isn't universally accessible in the frictionless way the book's tone sometimes implies. And a third point, more conceptual. The book leans heavily on writing as an alternative to difficult live conversation, but there are situations, active conflict that needs real-time negotiation, safety concerns, decisions requiring immediate back and forth, where a letter genuinely isn't a substitute for sitting down and talking it through in person. Clauser's tool is best understood as one addition to a relationship's toolkit, not a wholesale replacement for the harder, messier work of face-to-face repair. Even with those caveats in place, the book's central insight holds up remarkably well. Most of us are sitting on things we've never said to the people who matter most, not because we don't feel them, but because the live, real-time pressure of saying them out loud has kept us silent for years. Paper removes exactly that pressure, and removing it is often all that was actually standing in the way. The takeaway, what to actually carry with you. So let's set the anecdotes aside and see what's left in plain terms. First, writing isn't the lesser, backup version of a real conversation. For the things that are hardest to say, it's very often the more honest one. Precisely because it isn't produced under the pressure of someone watching your face in real time. Second, you don't need an occasion. The relationships that quietly starve don't usually die from one missing grand gesture. They erode from the slow absence of small ones. A three-line note tucked somewhere unexpected does more cumulative work than most people assume. Third, when a live conversation has broken down, a page might succeed where a phone call keeps failing, because it removes the real-time defensiveness that so often derails the exact conversation you were trying to have. Fourth, and this is the one worth sitting with, start with one true sentence and let that be enough. You don't need the perfect letter. You need the honest one, even if it's short, even if it's imperfect, even if your hand is shaking a little while you write it. There is right now almost certainly someone in your life who has never actually heard the thing you most want them to know, not because you don't mean it, because saying it out loud has always felt like too much to risk. Get a piece of paper, write the one true sentence. The rest, as it turns out, tends to follow on its own.